we're going to first of all talk about the short-term metabolic changes that occur in response to exercise. So that's to do with metabolism, of course. So that's about energy. So we're thinking about carbohydrates, we're thinking about proteins, we're thinking about fats, and then other sources that we already have in our cells, such as ATP. We have small amounts of ATP already there, and creatine phosphate. So that's a rapid supply of energy that we also have. And we'll also talk about the physiological changes that occur in response to exercise. So things to do with your heart and blood vessels, so where they dilate to and where they constrict to, for example. Before we go on to talk about the long-term adaptations that occur in response to regular exercise. And for the objective of today, we're mainly going to focus on aerobic exercise as opposed to anaerobic and strength training. But we will touch on that in different places. So first of all, we've got to think about where does the energy actually come from. So when we're exercising, of course, we need lots of mechanical work. There's lots of mechanical work going on. That's what's making us move. And our muscles, they already contain some energy. They already contain 1 or 2 seconds worth of ATP ready to get going if we need it in a short space of time. But really, there isn't enough. So we need to get energy from elsewhere. So we need to find other ways of providing our body with the ATP that we do need. And as we all know, in order to maintain exercise, we need to supply our muscles with an adequate amount of ATP, or energy. And remembering what's actually happening with ATP, what is happening is ATP is broken down, so adenosine triphosphate is broken down into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with the release of energy that allows our muscles to work. And remember, when the energy is released, we're also releasing heat. Don't forget that. So where does this additional ATP actually come from? Now, we have already talked about glycogen. We've already talked about proteins and fats. But actually, there are other sources of energy as well. So our muscles already have a supply of creatine phosphate in them. They already have a supply of glycogen. I've told you that a lot. We have 400 grams of glycogen roughly in our skeletal muscle. And we have a supply of triglycerides ready to go. And if we're looking at creatine, actually most of it is stored in our body as creatine phosphate. And so what happens is when we need energy very, very quickly, we break this creatine phosphate down. It reacts with ADP to form creatine and the ATP. And the ATP is then broken down further through this reaction up in the middle of the screen to produce ADP and energy. So it's a very quick way of producing energy. So in other words, creatine phosphate is stored when there is an excess of ATP in the muscle cell, and this is then converted into creatine phosphate from creatine plus ATP. So that's the important thing. When we have excess ATP, so we've just had a meal and we're not exercising, the excess ATP that we produce reacts with creatine to produce our creatine phosphate, which is then ready to go. So that's what is in our muscle already. But we also supply blood glucose to our working tissue, and the blood glucose, remember, is made in our liver. So it's either made by gluconeogenesis, or it's our glycogen stores are broken down to glucose, which enter the blood. We may use fats. Okay, so our adipose tissue breaks down is broken down, or rather the triglycerides in our fat tissue is broken down into fatty acids, which can then be used as an energy source. And likewise, proteins can be broken down into amino acids. They can go to the liver and through gluconeogenesis are converted into glucose, which can enter the blood. So in other words, we have lots of stores, but they're all released at different stages and at different intensities of exercise. And so there are two main factors that determine the amount of ATP required to perform our exercise, and actually the types of fuel that we require at each stage. So of course, if we're looking at intensity of exercise, we need to produce ATP at different rates. If we're working at a low intensity, we need to produce it slowly. If we're working at a very high intensity, we need to produce it very fast. And exercise duration. That the longer we are working for, the longer we need to produce ATP for. So we have to have a good store of ATP that can be released gradually over a longer period of time. So if we're looking at this little image right here, you can see that this is energy expenditure, and this is our relative exercise levels or intensity levels based on VO2 max or aerobic capacity. And aerobic capacity is just a measure really of how efficient your body is at producing energy, at working really. So it's the amount of oxygen that you use. It's based on your blood vessel strength, if you like, how good they are, your lungs, and your heart, okay, how efficient it is at pumping. And so the greater your individual VO2 max is, the greater those systems, or the better those systems are working. But if we're looking at what's actually used at different intensities, if we work at a very low intensity, you can see that we're primarily using plasma-free fatty acids, so fatty acids that are floating around in the blood. We're not using very much glucose, and we're not using very much skeletal muscle triglyceride stores either. As we start to work a little bit harder, we actually use less of the fatty acids from the blood, but we're using more of the skeletal muscle stored stuff. But we're now starting to use a little bit of our glucose from the blood, but we're using quite a lot of our skeletal muscle glycogen. So you can see we're having to work quite hard right now. And then when we work really hard, so at about 85% of our max VO2 max, you can now see that, again, the amount of fats we're using from the blood has decreased. And now we've got a decrease in the skeletal muscle fats being used as well. We're using a lot more glucose from the blood, and we're using a huge amount of skeletal muscle glycogen. And you can imagine as your VO2 max goes up towards 100%, you use even more glycogen. Now, fat is broken down much, much slower than carbohydrates. So therefore, as the intensity is increasing, the proportion of energy provided by fat also decreases. And likewise, as our intensity increases, if we're looking at this 85%, as that intensity of exercise increases, you start to produce more lactic acid. And lactic acid, by its very nature, starts to inhibit fat metabolism, so therefore less fat is used. So what you can see from this one is you get producing more lactic acid, and that is stopping the fat being metabolized. Less fat is being used, even though you're working harder in both of these from 65 up to 85% VO2 max. And so if we're looking at the systems that our body has to supply energy, we have 4 distinct systems, though they're working together, of course. So if you're a power jump, if you're using power events, such as a jump, for example, a shot put, or you're doing weights, or whatever it might be, you're going to primarily be using what's called the ATP creatine phosphate system. So in other words, this is a system that is used for very short spaces of time, where you need a lot of energy very, very quickly, or relatively large amount of energy quickly. So what you have is you have your creatine phosphate and ATP system. They're good for somewhere between 0 and 6 seconds. So that they can produce a relatively high amount of ATP that'll last you about 6 seconds. So it's not that much ATP, obviously, but it can produce it very, very quickly. So it can produce that ATP really, really quickly. And so that creatine phosphate and ATP is stored in the skeletal muscle, and it's basically available immediately. So this is great. It has great for your anaerobic power levels are good, but the capacity is quite low. You then have your sprint events, such as your speedy, sprinty events. And this is where you're using primarily your anaerobic system. So to start with, when you start your sprint, you'll be using your ATP, creatine phosphate system, but that'll run out quite quickly. So this anaerobic system is somewhere between the 6 to 60 second mark. This is where you're at maximum speed, you're at a very high intensity. It is still very, very rapidly available, but with moderate power. Okay, so the power levels aren't the same as in those power events. But you have a larger capacity than the creatine phosphate system. But of course, in this system, you're working anaerobically, so you're producing lactic acid. That lactic acid accumulates, that lowers the pH in your muscles, and therefore reduces muscle function. And actually what it does, it inhibits a whole variety of enzymes that are involved in ATP production, and therefore you start to produce less and less ATP because the pH, the acidic environment, is inhibiting the process, inhibiting the production of energy. You then have your endurance. This is where you're primarily, so your endurance, but at quite high in intensity. This is where you're primarily using your aerobic glycolytic carbohydrate system. So it's aerobic, so you're doing glycolysis in the cytoplasm through to the aerobic system in the mitochondria. And your aerobic system is good for anywhere between 2 minutes up to 1.5 hours, depending on the intensity. So it's basically there for moderate and high intensity exercise, and it's still quite a fast and rapid available system. And finally, then you've got your ultra events, ultra endurance, and this really is where you're working at a much lower intensity, and so you're using primarily fat as your energy source because you're working at that low intensity. Remember, you might be working for an hour, hour and a half on an endurance run, or even half an hour, but if it's still at a low intensity, you will then, of course, be using fat rather than carbohydrate system. So this is when we're talking about working at an intense level at those particular speeds, whether it's a power, a speed, endurance. Ultra endurance by its very nature has to be low intensity. So what are some of the short-term physiological changes that occur during exercise? Well, if you're thinking at the beginning of an event, not if you're just going down to the gym for a chilled out session, if you're going for a competition, for example, you get nervous. So you're anticipating that exercise. And that really is involving your sympathetic nervous system activation and the release of adrenaline into your system. And the release of that adrenaline and that emotional response to exercise cause bronchodilation. So your bronchi dilate, allowing more air to come in. It triggers hyperventilation through your emotional centers. Again, getting more air coming into your system. You get vasoconstriction to your viscera, that's your internal organs. So, well, many of your internal organs. So the non-essential ones. We're thinking about the GI tract and the kidneys and the reproductive organs. But you also, early on at least, get vasoconstriction to the skin. Okay, so you're not heating up at this point, so you don't need to lose heat. So right at the beginning of exercise, you get vasoconstriction to the skin. You get an increase in your cardiac output. So your heart rate is going up and your stroke volume is going up. You're starting to break down the glycogen in your skeletal muscle and in your liver. And from the stuff from your liver is entering the blood, so your blood sugars are starting to go up. And you're starting to release fatty acids from your adipose tissue, again, because of the actions of adrenaline. And then when you're exercising itself, there are lots of mechanisms that help to increase our cardiac output. So the amount of blood that is being pumped out of your heart every minute. So adrenaline is stimulating an increase in your heart rate and an increase in your cardiac contractility. So the amount that is pumped out with every heartbeat, so your stroke volume. And those together increase your cardiac output. Okay, so that cardiac output is increasing. But by the same token, you've also got an increased skeletal muscle activity going on. You're exercising. You're in the middle of exercise. That's compressing your veins. That's helping to squeeze blood to go back towards your heart. So basically it's increasing what's called your venous return, the return of blood through your venous system to your heart. And because the amount coming back to your heart through venous return is increasing, your ventricle gets bigger, okay? It's filled, so you get increased ventricular filling. And just like an elastic band, it stretches out further and it has a greater recoil, okay? Leading to an increase in stroke volume. That increased recoil are called Starling's forces, okay? So the Starling's effect is basically you're getting more blood into the left ventricle, it stretches out and then it squeezes back like an elastic band, forcing more blood out with each heartbeat. So your stroke volume goes up. And of course, by the same token, if you're looking down on the bottom left, you've got decreased blood going to your GI tract, your kidneys and your gonads. And if there's less blood going to there's more blood in your system, which means you've got an increase in venous return, again, leading to increased in ventricular filling and an increase in your stroke volume. So vasoconstriction initially occurs to your skin, but as you start to get hotter and hotter, you do get vasodilation to your skin also. And that's just to try and reduce some of that heat. But also, as you can imagine with this, your cardiac output's going up. So what's happening in terms of your blood pressure? Well, your blood pressure obviously goes up. And as we already know, the difference between your systolic blood pressure, so that's the pressure exerted on the arteries when your heart pumps out, and your diastolic pressure when it's relaxed, the pressure on the arteries when the heart is relaxed or filling, that is called your pulse pressure. And in health, that is proportional to your stroke volume, the amount that is being pumped out with every heartbeat. And so, for example, you might find that in regular aerobic exercise, your blood pressure goes up to 240 millimeters of mercury over 80. Okay, so you've got normally it's 120 over 80. So you can see that the systolic has doubled, the diastolic has stayed the same. So your stroke volume has gone up. But of course, it's slightly different in isometric exercises, such as your weights. In those cases, your systolic pressure can again rise up to 240, 250. But your diastolic pressure also increases, and it can go up to about 180 or so. And so what we're seeing there is in those isometric exercises, you're not getting a particularly large increase in your stroke volume, in particular compared to aerobic exercise. So what are some of these pressure changes that we're thinking about? So Your mean arterial blood pressure increases in response to dynamic aerobic exercise. Like I said, there's a large increase in your systolic pressure, it goes up to about 240 millimeters of mercury. Diastolic stays at about resting levels, around about 80. And as I've said, your pulse pressure is your systolic, take away your diastolic, and that is proportional to your stroke volume in health. And so as you can see from this diagram on the left-hand side, you can see that as the power output, the amount of power you're releasing through your muscles is increasing, your stroke volume is also increasing. Okay, and therefore your systolic pressure, this is almost a marker of systolic pressure going up as well. So your increase in blood pressure is normal, is a normal phenomenon during exercise. You expect it to go up. So why don't we try and reduce it again? Because remember, if you have a hypertension, if you have high blood pressure, your body actually wants to reduce it to normal. Well, the reason that doesn't happen is you have an arterial baroreceptor to blood pressure, and it's reset to a different mean arterial pressure. So in other words, it's reset to that exercising level. Because if that doesn't happen, if that didn't happen, your body would attempt to reduce blood pressure during exercise. So for example, it would try and reduce your heart rate and stroke volume. It would cause systemic vasodilation. It would reduce renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system activation. So that doesn't happen because your receptors are reset to a higher working blood pressure. So what are some of these, what's happening in the skin during exercise? So if you're looking at this little diagram, you can see the amount of blood going to different systems. So you can see when you're resting, you get a certain amount going to your brain. During exercise, it's about the same amount. When you're exercising, you can see the amount going to your skin and your internal organs, such as your GI tract, your kidneys, and your reproductive tract. And during exercise, that decreases, vasoconstricts. But what you can see in particular is you see in your skeletal muscle, there's only a small amount going there at rest, huge amount going there during exercise. So what's this telling you? At the early stages of exercise, you get vasoconstriction to the skin. Later on, of course, you get vasodilation there as you try to cool down. And so what's happening is it's adrenaline and the sympathetic nervous system are stimulating that vasoconstriction to those non-essential tissues. But as you start to work at a maximal rate, you're finding that about 80% of all that blood coming out of your heart every minute, so your cardiac output, is going to the skeletal muscle for working and to the skin to help you cool down. And because more cardiac output is now going to the skin, in particular in hot and humid environments, that's limiting the amount of nutrients and oxygen that can get to your skeletal muscle. So it's reducing performance. So you can imagine your performance drops even more significantly in climates like Queensland during the summer when it's very, very hot and very, very humid compared to other countries where it might be a lot cooler at the same time. And the sympathetic nervous system, as it's working harder and you're starting to overheat, starts to stimulate sweating. And so you get water and salts onto your skin, and that water then evaporates. And it's the evaporation that leads to heat loss, so the cooling down effect. So if you're in a gym, for example, and you're feeling very hot and you're sweating away and you wipe it off with a towel, that's not actually helping you cool down at all. The water needs to evaporate away to cool you. And so the hot arterioles, as you're vasodilating to the skin, allow for that heat loss and enhance that evaporation. You're also getting heat loss from the lungs, okay? Because if you breathe onto your hand, you know that it's a little bit warmer, so you're losing that heat. Presuming, of course, that the outside conditions are colder than your lung air temperature. So how is respiration controlled under normal conditions? And then, of course, what happens during exercise? Well, remembering that we've got a load of respiratory centers in our brainstem that are basically controlling our breathing rate and our breathing depth, our tidal volume. So we can consciously control our breathing. We can hold our breath if we want to, or we can hyperventilate if we want to. That's your voluntary control over breathing. And all that's doing is you decide to hyperventilate. That talks to your respiratory centers in your brainstem, causing you to do whatever you're telling it to do because you're making it happen. You have other receptors. You have pain receptors and emotional stimuli acting through the hypothalamus, part of our central nervous system. So you might have gone into a panic attack for whatever reason, or you might be in a lot of pain, you start hyperventilating. Again, that is through our emotional centers acting on our brainstem. As you are exercising, the receptors in your muscle and joints are moving, and because they are moving, they are stimulating the brainstem for you to breathe deeper and faster. Okay, so they're basically there. They know your muscles are moving, and if your muscles are moving, they're going to require more energy and more oxygen, so they stimulate our brainstem, our respiratory centers. You have stretch receptors, okay, in your lungs. As you breathe in further and further, at some point it'll get too much and you can't breathe in anymore, so they are inhibiting expansion of the lungs. You have irritants, okay. You might have a diesel truck driving past you and all the diesel goes into your lungs. You immediately hold your breath, okay. You could breathe if you really wanted to consciously override it, but generally you will hold your breath because irritants have stimulated irritant receptors, which are stopping you breathing because you don't want lots of irritants and smoke and diesel coming into your lungs. And we have central chemoreceptors. These central chemoreceptors are present within our brainstem, within the cerebrospinal fluid, and they respond to hydrogen ion concentration within the CSF itself. Okay. And we have our peripheral chemoreceptors. These are the ones that are in our aortic arch, in our carotid, for example, that are responding to the oxygen concentration, CO2 buildup, and hydrogen ion buildup within our blood. Central chemoreceptors are responding to what's in our cerebrospinal fluid, our CSF. Peripheral chemoreceptors are responding to what is in our blood. But what about during exercise? So that's what's happening at rest, if you like. What's happening during exercise? So we do get an increase in our minute ventilation. So remember, that's the amount, your tidal volume, the amount you're breathing, air coming in with each breath, and also your ventilatory rate, how often you're breathing. And that increase in minute ventilation is caused by many, many factors. So we have those proprioceptors in our active muscles and joints. As we've talked about, they are moving, they are stimulating our respiratory centers in our brainstem to breathe. We have our emotional hyperventilation before and during exercise, and we have that circulating adrenaline causing bronchodilation. And if you look at the arterial pH during exercise, you look at rest, it's about 7.4-ish, okay, your blood. And as the intensity goes up, as it gets more and more and more intense, suddenly the pH starts to drop. And that is because of a buildup of lactic acid, but also because your CO2 becomes very, very high, okay, and that, as we talked about previously, that leads to an increase in your hydrogen ions, which reduces your pH. So at very high intensities, the increased blood temperature that we have, the increased CO2 concentration, and the increased hydrogen ions from lactic acid further increase pulmonary ventilation. They're acting on our peripheral chemoreceptors, as well as the increased CO2 entering into our cerebrospinal fluid, being converted into hydrogen ions, and activating our central chemoreceptors. So what happens? At low levels of intensity, the changes that we see in ventilation are mainly due to an increase in our tidal volume. And at higher intensities, we also see an increase in our respiratory rate. Okay, so when you're working at a lower intensity, you just find yourself breathing in deeper and out further. At higher intensities, your breathing rate increases as well. And in a normal-sized, untrained adult, pulmonary ventilation can increase from, around about 10 litres per minute at rest to over or just around about 100 litres per minute at maximum intensity. So that's in someone who's untrained. In someone who is trained, in highly trained athletes, that pulmonary ventilation can reach up to 200 litres per minute instead of the 100 that is in a normal-sized untrained person. So what about the hormonal changes that occur during exercise? Okay, we have lots of hormonal responses because we want to deliver more energy to our systems that are working, but at the same time we also want to maintain our blood volume. Okay, so we have different systems at work. And so what we have, if we're looking at this little diagram, you can see the hormone concentrations during exercise, okay, and you can see the time of exercise. And so really the key points are, what you're seeing adrenaline, growth hormone, cortisol, and glucagon. They all increase during exercise, so you can see this value going up. And if you remember what they do together, they all increase our plasma glucose levels, and they all work to increase our fatty acid levels. So they are increasing the levels of energy in our blood that can be delivered to our working muscles. Insulin levels, as you can see, they decrease because adrenaline and the other hormones are anti-insulin. And insulin reduces your blood sugar, and you really don't want insulin to be released during exercise. Okay, because you don't want your blood sugar to go down, because you want the sugar to be delivered to your working tissues. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system acts to help maintain blood volume during exercise. And so the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system in this case is directly activated by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system is activating the release or causing the release of renin, which stimulates, as we know, the release of eventually angiotensin II and then aldosterone release, ADH release, vasoconstriction to non-essential organs. So it's basically stimulating the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which helps to maintain blood volume during exercise and therefore decreases the amount of blood going through our kidneys and the decreased amount of urine formation during that intense exercise. Growth hormone, as well as being produced during exercise, of course, is produced afterwards, and it helps us to repair muscle and other tissue damage if you've been working at an intense level. And growth hormone has a greater response in trained athletes than it does in untrained athletes. So another little really important thing that you have to think about when you start your exercise, you're going from nothing all out into a fast run or a fast cycle or a fast sprint somewhere, whatever that, or a football game, whatever it might be. And during that period, if you look at this, so time versus oxygen consumption, you immediately need a large amount of oxygen, okay, to get working aerobically. So in the first few minutes of exercise, actually, you have anaerobic systems that supply the ATP required for energy. Okay, so you use your creatine phosphate and ATP systems, and you use your glycolytic pathways. You're working anaerobically, you're producing lactic acid. And when you do that, you're getting that buildup of lactic acid. And that needs to be metabolized because it needs to go back to the liver and get converted to glucose. And this process requires oxygen. And this use of anaerobic nutrients, if you want to think of it like that, is called your oxygen deficit. And that accumulates at the beginning of exercise. You've worked anaerobically, but you want to be working aerobically, but you haven't been able to at the start, so you've got an oxygen deficit that you need to repay back. Okay, so that's what is happening in that early stages. So you might work really hard and you find yourself hyperventilating to try and get that oxygen deficit under control. You might even have to slow down a bit and then get into that steady state level, whereas you're in that moderate steady state where the oxygen demand is equal to the oxygen that is supplied. And of course, as well as that, there's a deficit which is occurring at the beginning of exercise, you get an oxygen debt at the end of exercise. And this is the excess oxygen that the body consumes after the exercise is finished. So for example, you've had your race, whatever it might be, and now you're finished. You sit down, you find yourself collapsed in a corner, and you're nice and tired. And you're now hitting oxygen debt. You've got to replenish the creatine phosphate levels that you've been using. You've got to replenish the ATP levels. That all requires oxygen, part of your oxygen debt. You've got to convert the lactic acid into glucose in the liver. That requires oxygen. You've got to remake your glycogen stores. Remaking the glycogen requires energy and oxygen. All these things are requiring ATP, which therefore means you require oxygen to make the ATP. You've also got in your skeletal muscle, you have myoglobin, and it's like a storage of oxygen. You've used a lot of that during exercise, so the oxygen has to be rebinding to myoglobin. That again is requiring oxygen, is part of your oxygen debt. So you can see all of these things require oxygen to produce ATP, to therefore make your glycogen or convert the lactic acid into glucose or replenish your creatine phosphate and ATP levels. They all require ATP. And oxygen is also required to bind to myoglobin in your muscle cells. So of course, the body really needs oxygen and ATP to adjust back to resting levels. You've got an increase in your body temperature. Your heart rate is increased, which requires more oxygen, of course. You have increased ventilation, which of course needs more ATP. But that increased ventilation is useful because it helps to blow off hot air and therefore is providing more oxygen. And as well as reoxygenation of your myoglobin, you need reoxygenation of any hemoglobin. So there is your oxygen debt. That's what you're doing at the end of an intense piece of exercise. So finally, if we're looking at other things, we're looking at hitting the wall. So when you work hard, you eventually start to run out of glycogen, both in your skeletal muscle, but also in your liver. And that causes someone to hit the wall where performance dramatically drops. So if your muscle glycogen is exhausted, then you're having to use fatty acids as the primary fuel because you haven't got any glycogen left to make the glucose. Fatty acid metabolism generates ATP at about half the rate of glycogen. So therefore, as you're producing ATP at half the rate, the long-distance runner, for example, which is where the term first came out, is forced to dramatically slow. In other words, they hit the wall. But as well as glycogen running out, there are other things that contribute to hitting the wall. Have a little think. What might there be? Press pause. Think what else might force someone or contribute to someone hitting the wall. Okay, well, there are many factors that contribute to hitting the wall. So running out of glycogen, as we've talked about, running out of blood glucose or running low on blood glucose, of course, are two very obvious ones. But there are others. So one is a loss of energy, as we've just said. Others might include dehydration. So if you're dehydrated, your blood volume goes down. Okay, and that can make you dramatically hit the wall. So you're losing fluid, but also the loss of electrolytes. If you lose electrolytes, your body is not working as effectively. Those action potentials aren't working as effectively because the electrolytes aren't there to make them work as effectively. And that's why people who exercise will be taking water on, will be taking electrolytes on, and will be taking glucose on when they're doing long distance exercise. But of course, if you've got some energy left, the sprint to the line is fueled by glycogen, the glycogen that is still left in your skeletal muscle. So if those reserves permit, that skeletal muscle glycogen allows a powerful anaerobic sprint to the line. It's usually running quite low, so that anaerobic sprint can't last that long in most people, unless they've been working within themselves.